Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the Stevens Initiative webinar. I'm Henry Shepard, Assistant Director of the Stevens Initiative, and for those of you who are new to the initiative, the Stevens Initiative is an international partnership aimed at increasing global competencies for young people through virtual exchange. The partnership is supported by the U.S. Department of State, the Bezos Family Foundation, the governments of Morocco and the United Arab Emirates, and several other public and private institutions. We're very pleased to have you join us for today's webinar on project-based learning and virtual exchange, which is presented by the Partnership for 21st Century Learning. We're joined by David Ross, CEO of P21, and Kim Murfitt, International Baccalaureate Coordinator at the Harold E. Winkler Middle School in Concord, North Carolina. After their presentation, we'll turn to your questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, we ask that you type those questions in the questions box on the right side of your screen. And if you have any technical issues, you can type about them in the chat box on the right side of your screen or email us at stevensinitiative@aspeninstitute.org. We're thrilled to turn it over to David and Kim to learn more about project-based learning in virtual exchange. So David and Kim, take it away.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you for joining us. The P21 would like to express its gratitude to the Stevens Initiative and the Aspen Institute for an opportunity to talk about something we care deeply about. So I'm going to ask Henry to push forward into our first slide. What I'd like to do is sort of set the context for a little bit about P21, and then we're actually going to dig into the way project-based learning begins in a classroom, whether it's through virtual exchange or you're sitting there with the kids themselves. So in this first screen, which you'll see in a moment, I want to talk a little bit about P21. We're a nonprofit. We're based in Washington, D.C. We're 16 years old, and what we focused on for the last 16 years is a list of student outcomes. Excuse me, I'm fighting a cold. A list of student outcomes. They're commonly called soft skills or 21st century skills, college, career, and life skills. They go by a bunch of different names, and there's a bunch of different frameworks. Ours is probably the oldest. Now, the linkage between what we're going to talk about today and the work that P21 has done is the linkage between student outcomes in a pedagogy that produces or is more likely to produce those student outcomes. Part of what you're going to see is some of the work I'd done in my prior position, which was as Senior Director for the Buck Institute for Education, which is another nonprofit and widely recognized as the global leader in research, resources, professional learning, and events around project-based learning. And last bit before we'll move on is Kim's our resident classroom expert on PBL and virtual exchanges, but I wear that hat too, or at least I used to wear that hat. I taught for 10 years, 6th and 6th grade in Los Angeles, in 4 years as a high school teacher doing PBL and virtual exchanges at New Technology High School in Napa. So the work that we'll talk about, and I'll give the PBL background before Kim switches over and gives you a hands-on approach, is grounded in 10 years of classroom experience on my part and 25 years of work worth of project-based learning. So Henry, I'm going to ask you if you can switch to the slide that shows our rainbow, which is our list of student outcomes. So if you can hang on for a second, where you're going to see, and if you really, if you can't see the slide as it appears from our Stevens team, one of the things to look at is if you go to p21.org, what you'll see if you look on a link that says Our Work, you're going to see this framework, which has been adapted from all over the world. So Henry's getting us set up there. And those of you who've done virtual exchanges know one of the truths of virtual exchanges in technology is that you practice something 37 times, and the 38th time you do it is when the glitches occur. So if you can bear with us for a moment, we will show you the screen. So while Henry's...
I apologize all. I am indeed having some technical trouble, but I'm working on it as fast as I can.
No worries, Henry. I've been in your spot many, many times, and I understand what's that's going to go. So I'm going to get, while we're trying to fix the screen image, one of the things I'd suggest while you have an opportunity, if you have another device, is the other website we're going to talk about at length is BIE.org. That's the Buck Institute for Education. They too are a nonprofit. They too, as I mentioned earlier, are the organization that's done the most work around presenting and popularizing project-based learning. So while Henry's doing that, I can see the slides on my other screen, and I'm a millennial. Even though I look like an old man, I'm running 3 devices at the moment. So if you see me glance left to right as I'm monitoring a Twitter feed on one screen, I'm looking at a PowerPoint on another screen. What I'd like the audience to do, and you can put these in the question windows. These are not questions. But one of the ways to launch a project is to do something called a need to know. And it's followed by an entry event. So an entry event is an engaging way to launch an inquiry. Now, those of you who come from back in the day like I do, remember that there was a 7-step lesson plan that came out of UCLA. And it began with a thing called an into, which was a way to engage the students and pique their curiosity. So we're going to start that. I'm going to read it to you, but what I'd like you to do in the question window or the chat window, I'm looking at both, is to write your responses. Now, this is a mock letter from your superintendent or head of school. So don't get excited. This isn't a real thing. We're going to model what the process would be like. So I would give you, as teachers, this document, again, a mock document. And here's some of the guidance from the superintendent. We want to broaden the scope of our virtual exchange program. We want to make the curriculum more rigorous. We want to use PBL. We want to explore some models for PBL. The Buck Institute is, to me, the best, but they're not the only model. We're going to focus on the SDGs. And for those of you who don't know what that acronym means, it's the Sustainable Development Goals that have been produced by the United Nations. And we think it serves as a great anchor for content. The next thing from the superintendent, we must include student outcomes such as the 4 C's. We need to have instructional coaches review all the teachers' project designs, and then we have to figure out what PD to teachers need. Now, I'm launching this webinar project by asking you or prompting you on a series of ideas and questions. This is what you would do in a classroom. You would prompt the students to engage them in the inquiry, and then you would let them generate questions about what the learning would look like. So those of you who have access to the chat window or to the question window in the interface, if you want to write some questions that you have for us, what is PBL? What does good PD look like? How much does it cost? Can I do it online? Are there other models of PBL? Where can I find those? What the heck are the SDGs, and how do I learn about them? What are the 4 C's? How do I teach them? How do I assess them? So those are some of the questions we could have you folks put into the chat window. So if you can take a moment and go ahead and type some stuff in, we'll move forward with our presentation. And excuse me, to prevent coughing, I'm going to take a sip of tea. So I'm going to pop over here to our question screen and see what we've got going on. Remember, you're mimicking the role of the learner in this institute. I'm the teacher for the moment, and you're the students, and you've just been given a task. Adopt PBL, use it in virtual exchanges, teach and assess the 4 C's. What do you need to know in order to be able to do that kind of work? Let's see what you have in mind. Okay, I see one of our earlier screens, and I mentioned briefly that P21, we'll walk back a little bit. So this is P21 and what P21 does. We're based in Washington, D.C. We sit at the middle, and we try to convene and advocate in business, policy, and practice on 21st century teaching and learning. So one of the questions that came in was, how can teachers begin with inquiry? And that's a fabulous question, and we won't have time to address this completely. I hope Kim talks about this a little bit. But one of the most important things is creating a culture of inquiry. is how do we create a space in the classroom where teachers, and we got our framework slide. So this too, again, we're a nonprofit. So you're seeing the framework from the P21's framework. It came out in 2006 and has been widely adopted all over the world. So this is the focus on student outcomes. Now we're going to transition. Henry, if you can move forward one more slide. We're going to transition in what is the pedagogy, the teaching style, the methodology that allows us to achieve these particular outcomes.
David, I'm sorry to say that I think the slides may be lagging considerably and my colleagues are trying to catch them up. I'm sorry about that.
Well, you know, one of the primary problems with using technology, especially in virtual exchanges, P21 works in a dozen countries now. And in the developing world in particular, we're having a problem with bandwidth. Oh, let's keep that slide up there. So I hope the viewers at home are watching a screenshot that says from the desk of the superintendent. This is what in project-based learning is called an entry event. We want to launch an inquiry. We give students a challenge or an idea or a concept, in this case in a memo, and we ask them to respond to it by asking questions. So these are the things I read off for you earlier. Broaden the scope of our virtual exchange program, make the curriculum more rigorous, use PBL, explore models, check out the Buck Institute, focus on SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. We must include student outcomes such as the 4 C's, that's that rainbow framework that you saw earlier. We need instructional coaches to review these teacher project designs. And what kind of PD, a professional development or professional learning, do the teachers need to be successful? So this is an entry event. If you go to the Buck Institute website, there'll be lots of content about how to do an entry event. The next stage, and if we can move forward a screen, is what's called a need to know. You ask the learners, this is the challenge or design concept or problem statement. What do you need to know to achieve that particular project or outcome? In whether you're using a whiteboard, an interactive smart board, whatever it is, a piece of paper, chart paper, you then write down the questions. Thank you. What do the learners need to know? This serves as a check of formative understanding. It's a formative assessment. I, as the teacher who's running this project, now know what my students are asking for. How do I do PBL? Where do I find resources for PBL? Let's keep this screen up because I don't want to eat up too much of Kim's time. This is one of 2 screens you're going to see. This is from the Buck Institute's work around essential project design elements. So you'll notice that the key of the lens there is key knowledge, understanding, and success skills. If you're in a Common Core state, those are your Common Core standards. If you're in Texas, they're the TEKS. If you're in England, it's essential competencies. China calls them competencies as well. Whatever are the essential student outcomes and skills are at the core of project design. And we have a couple of key elements. Sustained inquiry, meaning a project is not something you do in an hour. Ideally, it's something you do over 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. There must be a component of authenticity, meaning if it's not something for the real world, it's something that occurs in the real world. Example, I taught 6th grade for 6 years, ancient civilizations. I can't take my students to Iraq. There is a problem with taking young children to a war zone. But I can mimic what an archaeologist or an anthropologist would do in the field. We want student voice and choice. This doesn't mean that the students always pick the project, but it means they have a voice in how they demonstrate their understanding. Can I demonstrate it through a PowerPoint or a website or a play or a museum exhibit? It doesn't matter as long as they meet the outcomes, the standards, let them choose how they do that. There should be a component of reflection. Students have to have an opportunity to think about it. People call this metacognition. You need to build that into the curriculum, the project, an opportunity to reflect upon learning, critique, and revision. One of the biggest problems in schools, and I see this all over the world, is that we don't give students an opportunity to get formative feedback from peers, from the outside world, from their teachers, and to incorporate that formative feedback into revisions. We're looking at these, and I look at my own sons as they do their homework. They're given an assignment, they do it, they turn it in. There's no process in which revision or critique occurs. A public product, meaning ideally whatever the students are producing is viewed by the public, if not assessed by the public or presented to the public. And the final piece is there's got to be a challenging problem or question. We'll post up some links as soon as we get off the webinar about where do you get these questions, how do you write these questions, what do you look like in these questions. So I'm going to ask Henry if we can switch forward one more slide. Kim, I'm going to monitor time closely and try to get it to you as soon as possible. I'm going to skip a couple of my slides. The slide we're going to look at next is called Project-Based Teaching Practices. This is what you as the teacher or the instructional designer do. The first thing is, this is a standards-based approach. Whether you're in another country outside the US, you have national standards, or you're in a state in the US, you have state standards. You have to align the work to standards. These are not fluffy projects that we do to build a teddy bear or something. It's got to be anchored in standards. One of the questions that's already come in is about how do we begin with inquiry? We have to build a culture in the classroom. We don't have enough time to dig into that. We'll share resources on that. You as the teacher become the project manager. You have to manage the sequence of activities. This is a crucial understanding. We have to scaffold student learning. Just like you would in traditional instruction, some students very quickly understand the assignment, know what they have to do, and produce high quality work. Some students, for whatever reason, need more assistance. We're still going to scaffold the learning in a project. We don't just throw them into the deep end of the pool and say, hey, go build something. We have to assess student learning. We have to look at self-assessment. We have to look at peer assessment, and we have to look at teacher or expert assessment. And good PBL assessment is a mixture of all of those things. We, as the teacher, as the project manager, have to engage with students, and we have to coach. That means we have to walk away from the podium. We can no longer stand at the front of the room and dictate or lecture, because how can students develop the skill of communication and collaboration if all they do is sit in the room and I'll lecture to for 45 minutes or 60 or 90 minutes as well? And then we as a teacher are ultimately a designer. So Henry, we're going to skip forward at Henry and team. There's a couple slides that show details about the skills that we're talking about in our framework. I've already addressed that, so I don't want to belabor that one. The slide that I'd like to fast forward to is the one of the DNA double helix. And I want to make sure our audience understands how important this concept is. There has been experiential learning around the world almost since the 20s or 30s. It gained in power in the 70s. But the biggest problem with experiential learning, the biggest problem with experiential learning, which is the great granddaddy of PBL, is that it was unanchored in knowledge of a discipline, content knowledge, or standards. So skills existed, whether it's collaboration, critical thinking, communication, and creativity, off on the side, and we would try to teach or not teach these skills, and then we would go and we lecture and use textbooks and worksheets and teach people knowledge, math, science, history, and the two would never meet. So the best way to understand PBL and what you want as an outcome is the weaving together, a double helix, of skills and knowledge. Research shows that you learn knowledge better when you apply it and you transfer it. Research shows that you learn skills when it's anchored in a discipline. So what we're trying to do in good PBL is anchor the learning of skills and knowledge together, thus the DNA double helix. Now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Kim, who's going to anchor this in some very specific work she's done in an incredible school in North Carolina. So Kim, if we can forward one slide, we're going to show stories from the field. I hope I got this right. I was taking pictures from her school's website to set this up. And then Kim, I'm going to pass it on to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, David. So I just wanted to share a little bit of background about myself before I take you into some of the work that I've done with students. My name is Kim Murfitt, and as Henry had told you earlier, I am an IB coordinator for Winkler Middle School, which is located in Concord, North Carolina. And I have been in education for 19 years, and I'm also an ambassador for the Teach SDGs. And David has done such a great job sharing the amazing background on project-based learning, and it's not hard to see how this learning approach can just ignite curiosity and engagement for your students. And one thing that I appreciate about PBL is that it creates an environment that's truly learner-centered. And so with that in mind, I wanted to share with you how the Sustainable Development Goals and virtual exchanges can further enhance this work and create that learner-centered environment that David was speaking about, you know, wanting our students to be at the center of their learning. And so for those of you who don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, I know David touched on it a little bit. They are what I tell people are the world's largest to-do list, and it's in order to make our world better and more sustainable for all of us. And these goals were adopted in 2015, and there are 17 of them. And the goals are used to end poverty, protect the planet, ensure prosperity for all by the year 2030. All right, so one of the ways to truly engage our students in this real world problem solving that we've been talking about, you know, when he was talking about sort of anchoring this work where they're taking their standards, but they're also engaging in real world problem solving. To me, the best way to do this is through that work of the SDGs. And so in order to help students when they're gathering all that background, when he was talking about how the students will share what they know, what they don't know, we need to figure out how they can gather more information. Virtual exchanges are excellent for doing this. And I found that students, when they are able to connect with one another, they're limitless. And that's one of the most exciting things about teaching PBL with SDGs and through virtual exchanges. So if you could advance the next slide, one of the first places I wanted to look at was with email. And when I think about email with students, sometimes I think that it's almost sort of like old school, you know, email, is that really virtual exchange, you mean? But yeah, it definitely is. And with students, I find that they like having the opportunity to take ownership of their learning, and it shouldn't be our role as a teacher to fill in all those blanks for them. And so oftentimes what I do is let my students email other community members and other students, if possible, for information that they need in order to be successful. And all school districts have different rules when it comes to whether or not students are allowed to email or not. And one of the ways that we've kind of gone around that is creating a form where students have to compose their email first for approval. And that also gives us information about what we need to teach back to students, and it's that real-time constant teaching, you know, things you wouldn't even know sometimes that you need to teach to middle schoolers, like, hey, you shouldn't probably start out an email with, hey, could you give me this information? You know, there are certain ways that we go about speaking to one another, and you can't get more real world and things like that, where students are doing what we do as adults all the time. And so they're having an opportunity to do that. So when we were working on products for the SDGs, you know, some of the things that they would email for would be when we were working with zero poverty, students would email organizations in our local community asking them about how they work with homelessness and what is it like, and what are the problems and the struggles that they have, and things like that, because they couldn't create change if they really don't even understand the problem itself. And so using email in a real authentic way like that is absolutely, it's invaluable. And one of the other things that we've been experimenting with is just allowing our students to email one another outside of the class for more information for work that they're doing. And that's proved to be really successful as well. When they're not able to keep up with what's happening in the classroom sometimes, just being able to email another student is definitely valuable for them. One of the ways that I think that I saw email with students being really super successful was when we were working with SDG 11, which is all about sustainable cities and communities. Students would email different leaders across the world that we had learned about and watched them create change in their own communities. And they were just so full of questions, and being able to connect with those leaders and ask them the questions that they wanted to know that I could certainly not fill in for them. I don't know. I'm not those people. So being able to email them directly and ask their questions, the engagement, I can't even tell you. It's just amazing through the roof. So moving on to another way that we're using virtual exchanges with the SDGs and some of our projects that we're working on would be with video conferencing. So if you could advance to that slide, please. When we're working with PBL and SDGs, video conferencing is absolutely A+. Just having students being able to talk with one another face to face is something that you can't get any better than that, I think. Like David was saying, we can't always take our kids and just take them anywhere in the world, but with video conferencing, we pretty much are. And so there's different types of platforms or different ways that we go about doing this. I think the one-way video conferencing platform, I guess if that's what you would call it, would be through Skype and Google Hangout and Zoom. And when we started doing this with our teachers, honestly, I feel like the students were more comfortable with this than the teachers were. And sometimes the students end up teaching the teachers how this can work better. But one of the things that we learned right away was that it's great to have students be able to Skype kind of whole group and talk to, one person posing the question or whatever. But it was a lot more valuable when we can make smaller groups so that students could work within smaller groups and really collaborate with one another and gather the information that they were needing. And so that is sort of a learning curve for us, was we work with students in different virtual exchanges happening at the same time, because not all of the students need to be in a whole group hearing or interacting in the same way. And so providing those ways that students can kind of break out and work with their own virtual exchanges in video conferencing has been a challenge, but also very, very rewarding. And we are fortunate enough to have a digital den here and teachers who are willing to kind of use their time outside of the classroom to make sure that those things are happening. And one of the great things about the virtual exchanges that we have as an opportunity, I guess, is just that extended classroom space where students can continue to work outside of what's happening inside the classroom. And I wanted to mention two I guess learning platforms, that have been really helpful for connecting students to students if you're not familiar with them. And one of them is Empatico. And what they do is they will connect your classroom to another classroom. You just go onto the site, sign up for the need that you have to connect, and they will connect those classrooms together. And for teachers who are new to connecting classrooms, that's a very valuable tool. And then taking that a step further would be the Wonderment. And what they do is they not only connect classrooms and organizations of students together, but they also help you with service learning. So if you're interested in a certain project that you want to work on or a group of your students want to work on, they can connect to other students who are also interested in that area, and they can problem solve and create projects together. So it's sort of that extension of your classroom space. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is if we could go ahead and advance to that next slide, is like David was speaking about of student choice. I think that that is so very important, especially when students are reporting back what they're finding in their presentations. And through virtual exchanges now, it's sort of limitless. And so to me, it's very important that we honor our students' work, especially when they're connected to something as important as the SDGs, and that we're creating a space for students' voices to be amplified. And some of the favorites of middle schoolers are, blogging their responses, and we've also been able to connect with other students around the world where they can comment back on the blogs or share ideas for students to reflect on. And if you haven't checked out Flipgrid or Seesaw, for some of the younger students, you definitely would want to check that out as well, so that students have an opportunity to just amplify their voice and to create more change in our world. And so at this point, I know we're kind of running over our time spot. We wanted to be able to open this up for questions. David, did you want to add anything?
Kim, that was wonderful. Thank you. The only thing I wanted to add is, quite often, having worked on professional development for PBL for decades, is people ask for a concrete example of a project. And so I'm going to walk people through a project that we did that involved both virtual exchanges and project-based learning. Now, this was a joint project between some schools in Costa Rica and schools in California. Both countries, well, California thinks it's a country. I live there, that's how I know this, have issues with earthquakes, terremotos, as they say in Spanish. So there are standards in the science standards for California that require students to learn about tectonic plates and earth movements and earthquakes and things like that. In Costa Rica, they have the exact same standards that students learn because it's crucial to the understanding of their country and where they live. So that we put the teachers together. We were using Skype at the time because Google Hangout and some of these other platforms that Kim mentioned weren't quite up to snuff when we were doing this project. This was almost a decade ago. And we did pairing between, as Kim mentioned, the Wonderment Aspen Institute will actually pair schools together as well. My only caveat with Empatico is the last time I talked to them, they were focused mostly just on 3rd and 4th grade. So they may have expanded that, but there are lots of linkages, so you can do these virtual exchanges together, and we'll tweet out links to that. So we matched schools in Costa Rica to schools in California. We did a standard space project on earthquakes in both places. This is around 5th and 6th grade. And then for an entry event, remember, an engaging way to launch a project, the school in Costa Rica had a guest speaker from whatever their version of, like the Geophysical Organization or the U.S. Geological Survey in Costa Rica come and talk to the kids, and they recorded it so other schools could see it. California did the exact same thing from the U.S. Geological Survey to present the kids. That launched it. It's an entry event to launch the inquiry. Kids asked a million questions because kids love earthquakes and kids like to ask questions. That's the need to know. And then the teacher said, okay, how do we display our understanding? What are some of the things we can do? I don't remember what the Californian kids did, but the Costa Rican kids, their final product was something that was fascinating to me. Is what they did is they had the kids in each school, different towns and cities and villages, organize escape routes in case of an earthquake so that people could leave their community for safety's sake if there were a major earthquake. And they shared this with the local community members. The two kids, the schools in different places, shared information about earthquakes. They practiced their presentation to each other. They did peer editing across the internet, and they made their presentations and they published them. So that's a very concrete example of a virtual exchange in a project done well together across borders. So Henry, who's the Wizard of Oz behind the scenes, I believe traditionally this is where we open it up to questions. Is that accurate?
That's right. And Dave, if you can see the questions that have been typed in, you might know best which ones you think and in which order you think we should answer them. Do you see them there? And do you want to dive in wherever you think it's appropriate? I think we can also give another moment for any of the attendees to type in additional questions, again, in the questions box, and we will try to get to them in a sensible order.
You know, Henry, I don't see any questions, so I think my interface is struggling. So if it's okay with you, if you just want to fire off a question at me and Kim, and then we can take a shot at it.
That sounds great. We had a question from Beatrice earlier, and the question was, there are a lot of Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So the question is, how do you pick which one you want to dive into? And how can we get students doing this and owning this from the beginning?
Kim, if you want to take that one first, and then I'll follow on after. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I had my microphone muted. We had a bell ringing in here, and I was sure you didn't want to hear that. Absolutely. I think that when I work with teachers and it comes down to us choosing which SDG to start with first, the beauty of them is that they are interconnected. And so one always impacts another. So you can't go wrong with starting anywhere. But what I find most valuable is choosing what speaks to you first. If you have a passion for it, if you have an interest in it, that's only going to help your students even more. So you just start with whatever feels most comfortable to you, and your students will just naturally gravitate to it. And once you start, they'll be able to see how one issue is compounded by another issue, or how the goals are interlocked with one another. And one great resource that I would have to let you know about is Participate. So if you haven't seen Participate, you definitely want to check them out. There are a whole bunch of mini courses that are designed around the SDGs, and they are fantabulous. You definitely want to check them out. We give you the resources and really practical first steps to getting started with your students. So you can find that at participate.com.
And I want to latch on to that, and I agree completely with Kim, and I'll give you a specific example. You pick one of the SDGs that resonate. There are 17 of them, so it's difficult to cover them all. I used to teach 11th grade U.S. history in California, and I had 89 standards, so I would have gladly taken 17. But I'll give you a specific example. Some of my PBL colleagues live and work near Flint, Michigan. Obviously, water purity is a life issue for people in that part of Michigan. They were partnering with schools in Africa where quality or access to water, clean water, is a life-sustaining issue as well. So they picked the SDG focused on water. So I would review them. You could even do a survey of your community or throw it to the kids and see what resonates with them. You might have to put it in kid-friendly lingo, but it really is focusing on something that makes sense in your community, and then using virtual tools, and Kim's listed wonderful ones, finding partners that care about the same thing.
Thanks, Kim and David. We had a follow-up question, which was, are there SDGs that are particularly applicable to elementary students? And I suppose a related question would be, how do you think about age appropriateness and subject matter selection?
Kim, you want to go first again? Is that okay?
Absolutely. I think that with my work with teachers, one of the areas for elementary that students seem to really connect to is life below water. And you know, students are naturally kind of drawn to the oceans. And so looking at that work is probably a really good start. But I do want to say that I feel like all of the SDGs they can be taught to any age level, and you are the teacher, and so you know what your students can handle and how far to go when explaining the goals. And one of the great things about the goals is that there are targets underneath the goals, so you can look for specific targets to sort of like guide you in that work. And if you're an elementary teacher, one of the really great resources is the World's Largest Lesson. It is just a huge collection of all of these great resources that are age leveled. And so you could pick for the elementary level videos and comics and a lot of just kid-friendly hands-on work for you to get started.
And I want to tag on to that as well. One of my favorite techniques for designing curriculum is to use a simple thing like an Excel spreadsheet. And so one of the things, I would do my own version of curriculum mapping. I didn't want to spend a lot of money buying some kind of expensive software to do curriculum mapping. But when I left the classroom, the SDGs didn't exist, but I used this technique and I've taught it to others, is they build a spreadsheet and they list the 17 SDGs in one column of the spreadsheet. Then they look at their curricular standards and then they copy and paste them and put each of the curricular standards that they have to address into the spreadsheet, and they look for connections between curricular standards I'm responsible for, SDGs in which they're interrelated. I'll give you an example. In California, I want to say in 2nd and 3rd grade, they have to focus on neighborhoods and communities. Well, one of the SDGs is about safe and sustainable communities. Almost every elementary grade program has to do science around life and life forms and the basics of life and photosynthesis and things like that. Well, you've got things about life below water and what's the other one? Climate action and things like that. So to me, the key tool is to put them in a spreadsheet, map them to your standards, whatever your grade level, and look for a connection.
Could I say one more thing too? That I was thinking about in elementary schools, since the question was about elementary. I've seen a lot of schools too who adopt sort of a goal for the school, and that can be really valuable as well, because everyone is looking at work through that lens, and you can see that across all grade levels and across curricular areas too. So that can be a benefit as well.
Thanks, Kim and David, for the very thorough answers. We have a few questions here about time. So there are kind of two aspects of this here. The first is, what's an appropriate time frame for a virtual exchange like this, or a project-based learning virtual exchange activity or project, I guess? And secondarily, how do you manage time? Often, educators are short of time in the classroom and short of time overall. And so how do you deal with all of those pressures and make sure that the project gets its due?
This is a very common question in PBL. Do you mind if I start on this one?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So that's the number one question. It's about time. And it relates to a fundamental misunderstanding of what project-based learning is. Every teacher on the planet has done a project. And the way projects usually occur is I do direct instruction, cover my standards, do textbooks, lectures, worksheets, homework, paired reading, whatever. And then if I have time in the last 2 days, I will do a project. At the Buck Institute, we used to call those dessert projects, as if you eat your vegetables, then you get to have dessert. Well, to do PBL effectively, the project is the mechanism that students learn skills and develop knowledge, and that they're assessed on as well. So PBL is not something that you add to your traditional curricular instruction. It's the mode, the method, the vehicle you use to hit your curricular particular goals. So that's fundamental understanding number one. Fundamental understanding two is the duration of the project is dictated quite often by the number of standards you're covering. If a project's going to address 1 or 2 standards or a power standard, that's going to dictate the length of the project. So my sweet spot for projects is 3 weeks. I used to teach in core blocks, so that would have been somewhere around 30 hours of instruction. If you look at a model like EL schools, they do projects and they call them expeditions that might last 6 months. I never taught in that system, so that's not part of my comfort zone. I've seen people do projects very effectively covering 1 standard that might last 3 class meetings. There's a model in Singapore where they do a project a day. So they'll do a project stem to stern, obviously not going deep, but doing it in a day. So your standards are going to, the breadth of the standards you're going to explore is really going to dictate length. Now I want to address one more piece about elementary school. Obviously, if you teach in elementary, you have literacy and numeracy requirements, meaning you got to teach the kids how to count and you got to teach the kids how to read and write. So I've seen in elementary school where teachers do a block approach, meaning they'll do skill building, very explicit and traditional instruction for perhaps 30 minutes to an hour on reading and writing. Then they'll switch into application, which they call the PBL block. So we learned how to read. We're going to do a project on earthquakes. Let's read something about earthquakes, or watch videos and write journal responses and draw about earthquakes. And we'll build our literacy skills in that first hour. In the second hour, we then engage in something that's more authentic. Is the kids do research on earthquakes. They think about the escape routes like our friends in Costa Rica did. So again, breadth of standards dictates what your contact level is with kids. Do you see them 5 hours a day, 5 hours a week is going to dictate duration of project, but don't go too long and don't go too deep. The number one mistake people make when they adopt PBL is they write projects that involve math and science and history and PE and dance and civics and government and ecology, and it's a spectacular YouTube-worthy fail. Narrow your focus when you're launching PBL. I'm done, Kim. Your turn.
I couldn't have said it any better.
Thanks very much. I have one more question here that I have queued up right now, and I want to invite the audience to, again, go into the questions box and type your questions to share with us, and we'll make sure that that David and Kim get to them. So please do type any more questions that you have. We have a few more minutes here to go over your questions. One of the hot button issues in virtual exchange is always technology. And the question is, schools have started to bring technology into the classroom, but technology is not guaranteed in all classrooms. So what recommendations do you two have for how to do virtual exchange when technology is limited and when supplies are limited?
Kim, you want to start and I'll tag on now?
Sure. I am fortunate enough to teach in a school where we are pretty much one-to-one technology. However, our students come from very diverse backgrounds, and so we know that our students, once they leave us, may not have access to technology. So we do have at our school a sort of workstation for parents and students to come in and have an opportunity to have access to a computer there, or iPads and things like that, so that, sorry about that, Belle, that they have access here at our school. We also are aware of what our students' needs are, and so we do make time before and after school for students to access what they need. I don't think that a lack of technology should slow us down. It's just a matter of problem solving around it. Just like when our students don't have the supplies or anything like that they need, we just reach out to those that can help us in any way that they can. We do have community members who are willing to help out with providing some of the technology that we're lacking. We do have community spaces that students can go to as well, where they can use technology in the classroom. And I think really it's just a matter of using what you have.
I couldn't agree more, and I want to focus on a couple specific things. So I'll give an example from the field. I worked for a couple of years with schools in the Dominican Republic. And for those of you who know the Dominican Republic, they have some infrastructure challenges. And one of the most challenging issues in the Dominican Republic schools is the variability of electrical supply. So I was working in one of their schools in a poor area. They had a computer lab that was donated, but because there's fluctuations in power supply, there was a room next to the computer lab that had stacks of car batteries. And when the grid went down, somebody would run over, turn on the car batteries, and get the computers up to speed. So the strategy we used there was we went through asynchronous communication, because the schools they were matched with in the United States had better infrastructure, better equipment, and could communicate synchronously with the kids in the Dominican Republic. But the kids in the Dominican Republic, because of infrastructure issues, couldn't. So we used Google Docs and shared drives and things like that to post things back and forth. We would videotape the kids in the Dominican Republic asking questions, post those. When we had electricity, the kids in the US would respond asynchronously to that. The other thing that I'm a big fan of are video conferencing systems, and I've used this one in the developing world called Zoom, because Zoom works well in low bandwidth situations in the developing world. There's often bandwidth issues as well. And then the other final piece is the amount of screens available. So I've seen schools in the developing world in the US and poorer communities is rather than have every kid sit down in front of a computer and interact one-on-one or two-on-two with their virtual exchange partners, is there's one screen and the entire classroom uses it, whether it's an LCD projector or like what I used to do was I rolled in a TV and I would plug my laptop up to it and we use the TV as the monitor. So asynchronous virtual exchanges, one to many or many to many, and look at solutions in video conferencing that don't require a lot of bandwidth.
Thank you. We're seeing some comments in the question box of appreciation for these very helpful answers. So we really appreciate it. I think one thing that would be helpful to talk about now, David and Kim, based on your long experience in this field and the developments and changes you've seen and the leadership that you've shown, a question to you both is, what do you think are the sort of unresolved challenges that we face in the field today? What are the things that you think are sitting right in front of us that if we could make some progress on them now, now that we've resolved some earlier issues or honed some really good practices to resolve prior issues, what are the things that you're excited to work on now?
Kim, you want to take a shot?
Sure. I think mine, it's a threefold. Number one is that our students should not have to wait until they are older to take action. They are willing, they are able to create change in their world. And so they should not have to wait until sometime in the future. As teachers, it's important that we are taking full advantage of those opportunities and those pathways for our students to make change in their schools, in their neighborhoods, in their state, or larger, but they are able to do that now. It doesn't matter if they're in kindergarten or they're seniors. The other thing that I think is a challenge, but is something that is changing a lot, and I'm very thankful for that, is the community commitment to schools. And the community members are also willing and able to help us, but they're often not invited into our schools enough. And so we need to strengthen those partnerships because they are there to help support what we're doing here in the schools, and we can't fully be successful without their support. So creating those invitations and those invites, or those nights, I guess, or days for community members to come and serve and be a part of your school is really important. And the third thing is PD for teachers, like ongoing structured ways for teachers to get quality PD. It shouldn't just be for the few, it should be for everyone. And the support that teachers need in order to continue to grow in this is something that I hear constantly. And so that's also something that I find to be really dear to my heart, is providing pathways for teachers to continue to grow.
I couldn't agree more with what Kim said. I want to dig a little deeper on a couple of the ideas. One is virtual exchanges, especially if they involve video or video conferencing, I've got deep concerns about viewing people in another part of the world as the other. And so Kim touched upon professional development, in not just about pedagogy and technology, but in cultural competences. How do we train teachers and they train students so they don't view the people they're working with as weird or other? It's different, not better, not worse than them. So teaching them modes of communication and genres of communication. Now, I have a bad habit of being on video and doing thumbs up. That's not well received in some cultures. So I constantly have to monitor myself, and I obviously don't do a very good job of it on doing a thumbs up gesture as well. So how do we equip teachers, Kim mentioned PD, with the cultural competence skills that they understand what effective cultural competence and communication is? And then how do we translate that to students? One of my favorite lines, I'm a dad, I've got 2 teenage boys, and I can't remember where I read it, but the line went something like this: children think the normal is extraordinary and the extraordinary is normal. And that's based on the house they grow up in, the parents, the food, the language, the demographics, the money they have. So my kids grew up in a lovely part of California. but to extremely well-educated parents who've been happily married for a very long time. To them, that is normal. But when you look at the numbers, that's extraordinary, but they don't know. And then they'll go to somebody else's house and they'll see something that is what they think is extraordinary, and it's absolutely normal to the people there. So we have to equip kids and teachers with the understanding, the cultural competence to communicate and work effectively together.
Thanks to you both. I think maybe the last question of today's session, unless we end up short on time, is how do you know if the project-based learning experiences that you are facilitating are working? How do you think about measuring or at least understanding what success looks like?
Kim, I'll start with that, and how about if you have the last word? So one of the analogies I use is, as a former athlete, I don't look at now, but I was a successful athlete in my younger days, which was a very long time ago, is I knew what the ultimate outcome, whether I played basketball, football, and ran track, is I knew where the end zone was, I knew where the basket was, I knew where the scoreboard was, I knew where the goal was, I knew where the finish line was. Is when you're embarking on a project is be very clear about what the outcomes, and the outcomes need to be focused on both skills outcome, collaboration, critical thinking, cultural competency, and domain specific outcomes, math, science, history, and things like that. The kids need to know where the end zone, the basket, the goal is in advance. They also need to receive feedback along the way, formative feedback from peer assessment, self-assessment, teacher or adult assessment, so that they know. And then the final piece, and this is very difficult for teachers, you have to accept the surprise. So one of my favorite ways of assessing projects is I use standard spaced rubric, and then I have on the far right, which traditionally is the highest achieving part of a rubric, is I leave it blank, because kids who truly extend the learning and take it in unsurprising directions, we don't know what that is. How can we script what is unusual or creative or innovative? So I use a narrative in the final column to define kids groups who took it to a whole new level or an entirely new direction. Kim?
I agree with you, especially in that standards-based assessment part of the rubric. One of the things I'm always asking students for is like, what's next? So here you are now, what's next? What are your next plans for growth? And their ability to articulate where they plan to go now. If the learning was successful, they should want to continue that learning in the future.
Thank you. We have really just maybe 1 minute left for each of you to share any final thoughts you might have. I'm thinking especially of anything you'd like anyone new to this practice of project-based learning in virtual exchange. What would you want to say to them, either to advise, encourage, caution?
Kim, you want to go?
I would just say that our students deserve for you to step out of your comfort zone. And everything at first always seems sort of bigger than we are, but nothing is bigger than we are, because we have the support of one another as teachers. And now even talking about virtual exchange, like on Twitter and building your PLN and all of these different ways to support one another. So it's really important for you to just take that first step, even a small step, so that your students have an ability to grow and to learn in ways that you haven't been exposing them to before. So if you haven't given it a shot, either virtual exchanges or PBL or in the SDGs, I just encourage you to just take one small step today to start making changes.
Kim, that was beautiful, and you were looking at my notes, I can tell. The thing that I would suggest is, in line to what Kim said, is every day in classrooms we ask students to take risks, whether it's to do popcorn reading or come to the board and do a math problem or something like that. We're asking them to risk their dignity to become a public learner. How can we, as an effective teacher, ask students to do something we're not willing to do? So to do PBL or virtual exchange is a risk. You're learning publicly in front of kids, but you need to own that and be a co-learner and say, hey, I'm not entirely sure how this is going to work out, but we're going to try it. And so owning that, taking that risk, modeling for students that we need to fail forward, we need to learn from our mistakes, we need to iterate on that thing, is the most important decision you can make to create this culture of inquiry for virtual exchanges in PBL.
David and Kim, thank you so much for joining us today, and especially thank you for rolling with all of the technical issues that we faced at first. We'll be sure to follow up with a blog post on our blog on stevensinitiative.org to share more information to make sure that folks get access to what was shared today. I know there were several questions about maybe repeating some of the specific platform or organization names that were mentioned, and any other resources that David and Kim want to share, we'll be very happy to spread the word. We hope that you will sign up for webinars in the future. If you registered for this event, we have the contact information to follow up with you, and we'll certainly invite you to more webinars in the future. We also encourage you to visit P21's website, learn more about their great work, and take it from there. So thank you so much for being with us today. Thanks again to David and Kim, and we hope you have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.